Hello and welcome to a special edition of the State of the Fleet Market video series. It's produced by Automotive Fleet Magazine, and it's designed to put a spotlight on key issues that are occurring in the commercial fleet management industry. And today I have the honor to interview Pat O'Connor, a longtime legislative counsel for the NAFA Fleet Management Association. And today we're going to discuss the successful resolution of an unintended tax consequence for the employee use of company provided vehicles that occurred during the shelter-in-place mandates, which were instituted during the COVID-19 pandemic. So with that, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us, Pat.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm glad to be with you again.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our discussion. So let's get started. Personal use of a company vehicle is considered a taxable fringe benefit. So could you explain to the viewers how the shelter-in-place mandates that occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic created an unintended tax consequence?
Sure. I mean, the assumption is that if an employer provides a vehicle to an employee, that the employee is going to be driving that vehicle for the course of the year, conducting the normal work practice of the employer, of the company. What happened with shelter in place is suddenly these vehicles were not being used. They were parked at home. There was some limited business use of the vehicle, but in many cases, the employee was working from home, working virtually. And so the number of business miles being driven by the employee had dropped dramatically during the shelter in place.
Okay, go ahead, continue.
But lo and behold, what fleets were finding out is that because of use of the annual lease value rule, there was a percentage of use still considered to be business use, although that vehicle wasn't being driven. And so that created this unintended tax consequence that fleet managers brought to NAFA's attention over the summer.
Mm-hmm. And so you successfully worked with the IRS and various other governmental entities to help resolve this issue. And recently the IRS issued notice 2001-7 on addressing this. Could you explain what's included in this notice and how it'll benefit fleets?
Sure. Under the current IRS regulations, a company has a choice of using the annual lease value for personal use or a cents per mile for personal use. Those are two of the options, but you can't use both. You only can use one. So what we did is we went to the IRS and said, because of the shelter in place problem that was created by the annual lease value rule, can you make an exception for 2020 to allow a fleet to go from annual lease value to a cents per mile rule? So what the IRS agreed to in their notice that they released just this week was that you could use the annual lease value rule up to March 13th. March 13th was the date that President Trump declared the national emergency. Mm-hmm. From March 13th to the end of the year, if you wanted to, you could change to the cents per mile rule. You're not required to go from annual lease value to cents per mile. You can if you want to. What the IRS said, though, tellingly in their notice, is that use of the cents per mile rule more accurately will charge the employee for business use during the time of the pandemic. So that was the issue that we had raised with the IRS. You need to allow us to use the cents per mile rule because that is an accurate assessment of the true business use of a personal use of an employer provided vehicle during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So the request was pretty simple. Bend your rules for 2020 to allow a fleet to go from annual lease value to cents per mile. Mm-hmm. And so as of March 13th, you could start using the cents per mile. Before March 13th, you would use the annual lease value. So there's a little bit of math gymnastics that have to be done.
Well, we want to commend NAFA because you were the first one that brought it to the attention of the government. It was definitely an unintended consequence. They
Yes.
weren't looking to bring this about. It just happened because of this very unique circumstance. And, bringing this about wasn't as easy as just picking up the phone and calling the IRS. I mean, there were a lot of other things that were involved in. And I know you had an outreach not only to the IRS, but also to the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, the House Ways and Means Committee. And I'm wondering if you could just take a moment and explain to the viewers the sequence of events that brought about this resolution.
Sure. The first step in the whole process was a call we got from a NAFA corporate fleet member who had identified this problem, contacted Bill Schankel, NAFA CEO, and contacted me and said, "This is what's going to happen because of shelter in place. What can we do about it?" So I reached out to the lawyers at the Internal Revenue Service. And that was not easy because the IRS has been really under a almost siege implementing a lot of the COVID-19 tax provisions. But we finally got through to the lawyers at the IRS, explained the issue to them. And so that I went back and forth with them for a couple of months. Uh, I then NAFA felt that we needed to do some more advocacy outreach. So at that time, NAFA also sent a formal request to the IRS commissioner to make it a formal request that they provide this relief. We also, as you mentioned, reached out to the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee, asking them to weigh in with the IRS commissioner to to nudge the process. I also then reached out to the White House and put this and made White House staff aware of it, of the unintended consequences. So it was all designed to make sure we kept it on a front burner at the IRS.
Mm-hmm.
We got into, I had a number of conversations with the Internal Revenue Service. At one point, they came back with a list of questions. And as you can imagine, anytime you're asking for tax relief of any kind, they get suspicious. So they came back and they said they wanted to know the type of employee that was impacted by the annual lease value rule. So, we did a quick survey of some of our fleet members. We knew what the answer was, but we did a quick survey anyway, that we weren't talking about doctors and lawyers and corporate CEOs. We were talking about sales associates, repair technicians. So we provided that list to them. Then they wanted to know what kind of vehicles were we talking about. Were we talking about the Mercedes and the BMW? And we went back to them and I got a list basically with the help of automotive fleet publications of, no, these are the typical fleet vehicles that are impacted by this. The F-150s, the Ford Fusions, etc. So we provided that to the IRS. And then we provided and I got this from a couple of NAFA members, just a comparison of miles that were being driven pre-pandemic and then during the pandemic. Some spreadsheets that some NAFA members had put together. So we provided this information to the IRS. They repeatedly assured me that they were working on it. We were not getting any negative feedback. They were not moving as fast as we would have liked them to. But finally, this week they did.
Mm-hmm. Well, congratulations. Now, if a company wants to make this switch in the valuation method that they use in calculating this tax, how do they go about doing that?
That is just a decision that they make.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the IRS notice for 2020 explains how you would compute the annual lease value from January 1st to March 13th. You essentially would prorate the annual lease value for that period of time, and then beginning March 13th, you could use the cents per mile rule. And it's important to point out that after March 13th, you could use the cents per mile rule through the end of the year, even if the vehicle was back in use.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not limited to cents per mile just during the shelter in place period.
Okay. Well, congratulations and thank you for helping to resolve this issue that's was extremely important to the commercial fleet industry.
Sure.
And I think your success really reinforces the importance of industry associations such as NAFA in representing the interests of the entire fleet industry. So, on behalf of the industry, I'd like to thank you and NAFA for this very successful effort. So, thank you again for joining us, and I appreciate you taking the time, Pat.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much.